We are live.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Red Brick Summit 2020, we welcome you all to the TRBS Speaker Series. TRBS, in collaboration with the Women's Leadership Society and Equipoise, the Economics Club of IMA, is extremely honored to host Jayati Ghosh ma'am. She heads the Center of Economic Studies at JNU and is a developmental economist. She did her PhD in economics at Cambridge. Her core areas of interest are international economics, macroeconomics, and gender. As the UNDP Excellence in Analysis awardee, the Satyendranath Sen awardee, and the recipient of the NordSud Prize for Research in Social Sciences, she is at the forefront of research in the development sector in India. Today, she will share her perspective on the topic, role of women leaders in developing economies. Audience members, we have shared with you a Google form over email, and the same has also been added in the YouTube description. Please feel free to add your questions in it that you would like to ask Jayati ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, and it's a very great pleasure to be with all of you. I really enjoy talking to a diverse group of students, and I'm really very happy to have been invited for this summit. So thanks for inviting me. Also, just a clarification, I've actually retired from JNU at the end of September. I was there for nearly 35 years. It's a very, very long time, but I've retired from there now. And from January, I will be teaching in the US in the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So it's a kind of major shift. I'm looking forward to it, of course, but also it's a very different system that I'll be entering. So this is a very broad area that I'm going to talk about today, the role of women leaders. And it's one which excites a lot of, shall we say, emotion. And the analyses often tend to be very, very tinted by the perspective that you begin with, whether it's necessary or not. There is, of course, if you like, the politically correct version of this important, which is that it's important to have more women, not just in leadership roles, but in everything. And that goes without saying. I mean, it's like just as it's important from a broadly egalitarian perspective to have much greater representation of gender, but also of region, of caste, of class, of, all of the usual forms of diversity and difference. There is that, of course, but increasingly people have been making an economic argument for increasing diversity. And it's been found, there's a lot of interesting economic research actually that suggests that diversity brings you advantages which are beyond the purely sort of welfare or distributive or ethical kinds of advantages. So we need to distinguish between the two. There's one, which is that you need to do this anyway, because it's good, it's desirable, and it's what we want for a society. That's one way of looking at it. For example, you could say that education is a human right. Everybody should be educated up to a certain minimum, and that's independent of any other kinds of benefits it may bring society. Similarly, people argue that diversity, equality of opportunity, or what is called equity nowadays, and all of these things are important in themselves, and that's certainly important. And I'm going to put that aside because I think we can all accept this. This is, if you like, the kind of ethical basis on which we proceed. But there are advantages extending beyond that. So what are those advantages of diversity? Now, this is what's interesting. A lot of empirical research has found that where you have more diversity in leadership at all levels, not just necessarily a president, prime minister, or cabinet ministers, but at different levels of government, where you have more diversity, expressed along different dimensions, there you are much more likely to have stable and equitable growth. And often you will get much greater growth dynamism over time, and you will have more resilient economies. Now, resilience is in fact something that we are talking about a lot nowadays, once we realize how most countries are really not resilient at all, and most economies are not resilient at all, even to relatively small shocks like the pandemic. I'm saying it's a relatively small shock because we have much, much bigger shocks coming in the form of climate change and so on. Okay, so why is diversity important? And essentially, it has been found that whether it is men, women, or it is different regions, or it is different linguistic groups, or it is different ethnic groups, and most of all, if it is different class groups, having different voices at the table allows those who are making and implementing policy to recognize both the difficulties of particular policies and the potential constraints and the actual ways in which they could play out. And I'm going to give you examples of this specifically with relation to women in a minute, but that's really the underlying, if you like, conceptual premise is that diversity plays a role in making economic policy more dynamic, more sustainable, more resilient. And it does so by bringing on the table aspects of particular issues and concerns that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily have thought of. Now, what does that mean? It means really that inclusion has a significance that goes beyond, its inherent properties. It's good in itself. It's a nice thing. It's motherhood and apple pie. We all want it. It's, desirable. But it has advantages that go beyond those pure welfare kinds of considerations. And we find also, therefore, that the current pandemic is actually a very interesting example. Globally, if you look at it, the countries that are lauded often for their very balanced and relatively successful approach to dealing with the pandemic. New Zealand is a classic example. The New Zealand Prime Minister has just won a very decisive mandate again because of the effective, balanced, and yet humane approach that was taken to dealing with the pandemic. Angela Merkel in Germany has also been lauded for the fact that the approach to the pandemic has throughout, in her case, been very sensible in that she has shared with the public as often as possible and as transparently as possible whatever information she has access to and what she is making of that information. And she has done this in a way that appears to be, shall we say, apolitical, insofar as governments can appear apolitical. That is, she's not taking a particular side. She's saying, this is the state of knowledge we have. This is what the scientists are telling me. This is the information I'm getting about the spread and how it is spreading and which particular forms. These are the different pros and cons of the various responses that we are faced with. This is the decision we have taken about that response, and this is why we're taking that decision. So, in other words, you're engaging and involving the people. It's a very participatory approach in that sense to a policy, and it therefore establishes much greater trust in a community. So, the other thing we have found in relation to this virus in particular is that you cannot control it without a very strong sense of public trust and solidarity. Social solidarity has been an essential element of controlling virus. The countries that have been successful have a relatively high degree of trust and faith in the government and a sense of community and responsibility towards the community. Vietnam is another example, which has been relatively successful in controlling this, again, sharing these characteristics. Of course, there are other things. There's the state of the public health system, the kind of spending you do, all of those are there. But why have some women leaders been more successful in this particular case? Because their own leadership styles have embodied that kind of inclusive and participatory approach in which they're not saying we know everything, when they're not saying here is the answer, they're saying we don't know, but here is what we do know. Here is how our knowledge is changing week by week. Here are the different strategies that are proposed, and here's what we are going to do. And we may change it if we think that it needs changing, but we will keep you informed about all of that. That to me is something that stands out simply because it's so different from what so many other people are doing. Whether you look at the way Bolsonaro has handled this in Brazil, or President Trump is handling this, or other countries where I will not necessarily name, but essentially, the macho authoritarian approach, whether it is one that arbitrarily imposes lockdowns that give very sweeping promises about their results, as we had in India, which didn't work, or that claim that there's no problem and everything's going to be fine. Both of those strategies, very, very macho in orientation, have failed so far, certainly, and are likely to keep failing. But that's just the pandemic. Let's just look now at developing countries and see, are there examples of women leaders who've been really quite successful in particular things, and what are those things? By this, I don't want to make a claim that all women leaders are great. They certainly are not. Nor do I want to make a claim that on average the women leaders we've had are always on better than a bunch of men leaders. Nor do I want to make a claim that we cannot find examples of authoritarian and negative leadership among women as well. But there are certain features that have stood out for a number of women who have led countries in the developing world that are really quite interesting and I think deserve more attention. And one of them, I would argue, is the fact of greater inclusion even in other leadership within the in other areas of governance. So let's take the case of Taiwan's leader, Tsai Ing-wen. Okay, she's a woman who is often known abroad basically because of the she's taken a very strong anti-mainland China position. But what's more interesting, I would argue, is that she has actually, within Taiwan, one of the sources of her popularity is that she has made a real effort to be inclusive of the different ethnic groups. We often forget that China is also multi-ethnic. There's a domination of the Han Chinese. I think it's 85% of the population, both on the mainland and in the Taiwan province. But there are ethnic groups, and typically they have been underrepresented in any kind of policy making or leadership, and they are often oppressed and marginalized in different ways. So in Taiwan, she has actually, Tsai Ing-wen has made a determined effort to give voice to the Amis, the Atyal, the Paiwan peoples who have been historically ignored. And by giving voice and representation, recognizing their specific concerns and constraints, she has managed to bring them into the national or the Taiwanese fold in a much more successful way than simply ignoring them or treating them the way the Uyghur in Western China are being treated by the Chinese government. When you look at another example of a president who was not particularly successful economically, but I would argue successful in some other ways, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the president of Liberia for a while. Now, she came from the World Bank. She had a basically neoliberal approach to the economy, and she had a lot of strategies which turned out in some ways not to be so successful. But in one particular way, she was extremely successful. Liberia is a war-torn country suffering from civil war for decades, with the rule of what are they called, warlords dominating over the country, and those warlords often reflecting ethnic and tribal divisions. She really made a focus on bringing in the different ethnic groups into the cabinet, bringing in the voice of different tribal and ethnic groups into governance in general. And that created an era of peace, which was remarkable for Liberia, which actually then laid the groundwork for a subsequent, more peaceful transition to economic growth, which would not have been possible otherwise. You look at Michelle Bachelet, who was the president of Chile in 2 different terms, and may well be the president again, or at least have an important position in Chile again with the next election. And one of the things that she insisted on always was more than half representation of women in the cabinet. I'm going to come back to that because I think that's important. It's important. Why? Because it's not enough to just have one woman leader, whether it is a government or a company or any level of government. It's not enough to just have 1 or 2 at the top. Because if the whole culture of an organization is male in many different ways, then that woman is forced to behave like a man, if you see what I mean. And we've had leaders like that in India. We've had Indira Gandhi, who the talk about her when I was a young person growing up was that, oh, she's the only man in a cabinet of women, which is a terrible sexist, misogynist thing to say, but it reflected the idea that she was the strong ruler, and she was actually very macho in many ways. And so, having just one woman on top doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to generate a broader culture of the recognition of gender concerns in policy making. Michelle Bachelet insisted on half the cabinet, and it led to a plethora of policies, schemes, and recognition that changed the way in which you actually consider uh, how you're spending money, how you're organizing economic policy, what you're leaving out when you do particular policies, etc. It doesn't only have to be women who do this. The ruler of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, uh, he was in fact one of the people who also insisted that half the cabinet has to be women. And Ethiopia is a very patriarchal society, not as bad as India, perhaps. We may be among the global leaders in this, but definitely also a patriarchal society. So doing that itself was seen as outrageous. Yet he not only found qualified women and gave them positions of power. The cabinet is half women. So the courts are now increasingly dominated by women. The bureaucracy is dominated by women. When I say dominated, I think they're approaching half or reaching sometimes more than half. And all of these are making a major difference in the institutions. Now, when I say they make a difference, what kinds of difference do they make? Essentially, as I mentioned, they bring on the table aspects that people don't think about, don't recognize. And I can give you many, many examples, but I'm going to stick to examples from India because I think that was going to bring this home to us much, much more directly. There are attitudes to policy, or even, what is a priority in policy, which are taken for granted so much because they have been dominantly male that people don't think about it. One very basic one is just the availability of basic facilities and amenities for women, infrastructure like public toilets. When I did something for the Planning Commission, it was about a decade ago, that we were asked to look at various kinds of infrastructure. We were a group looking at gender, basically engendering the plan and how to make it much more recognizing the concerns of women. I took up the issue of toilets, public toilets. In the city of Delhi at the time, I forget the exact number, but approximately there were some 4,650 toilets for men, 280 toilets for women. In the city of Delhi, we're talking about the city with the so-called most developed infrastructure, the capital city. That was the ratio, okay? 4,680 or some such thing for men, 280 for women. What does that tell you about women in public spaces and their ability to just function in basic things? How many of them can afford even to be street vendors? How many of them are able to engage in activities that require them to be outside and on the road for significant periods of time? When in the state of Kerala, we had a left front government, one of my friends was in the planning board in Kerala. And she was entrusted with the task of actually going around and talking across the city, the state to the panchayats, the elected bodies, and the women in the panchayats. We have 30% representation of women. And in Kerala, in fact, it's slightly more. In fact, it has ended up being half women. She came back from this and told me, the one thing we have to do, we have to build toilets because everywhere the women are saying we cannot function in the public sphere because we don't have toilets. Nobody had thought of this, even in a left-leaning state for decades. We're talking nearly 70 years after independence, right? So, in fact, it became a joke. The state budget for that year, people were calling it the toilet budget. Men in the state assembly were laughing, saying, ha, 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 all they're doing is building women's toilets. But they made it and they ensured that in every public place, bus stops, railway stations, shopping centers, ordinary markets, etc., 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 there would be at least as many functioning proper women's toilets as there were for men. And where there were none at all, you would definitely build for both men and women. So it became known as the toilet budget. It was a source of great humor, but it transformed the lives of women who had to go out to work. It enabled many others who were earlier hesitant for various reasons to do so. It's not something we think of. It's not something many of us would even think of because we don't, men certainly don't think about it, but it acts as a major impediment to women's engagement in the public sphere and in outside the home activity, which only comes in the open when you ask women, or when you have enough women in positions of power who are able to take up this issue in a significant way. Similarly, the whole issue of hours of work and time use and afforestation and things like that. Let me give you another example about labor time. Probably this was when you were all in school or something, but there was a major afforestation drive in India. Maybe you were even in middle school or primary school. Major afforestation drive in India, and it was seen as very successful. Okay, it was seen as one of the big successes that we managed to regenerate forests in large parts of the country which were getting denuded. And how was it done? Through what was seen as a very participatory public system, which was to actually bring village forest management committees into the picture. And that would have one person from every household in the village in that committee that would decide that we're going to basically regenerate this hill, so we're not going to allow access to villages there, allow that to regenerate so that the common lands would once again become forested and so on. Fine, excellent, big green tick mark and so on. Research done by Beena Agarwal and others finds that after this afforestation, the hours walked by women to collect fuel wood doubled in 8 of the states where they did the time use surveys. Why? Because essentially these village afforestation forest management committees, one person from every household. So guess who gets to go? It's the man, right? The man attends these meetings. And the men never collect the firewood. At that time in India, 80% of rural households required firewood. They collected fuel wood for their basic fuel. Okay. And of course, the men never collected. It's always the women. And it was found that the time they had to collect firewood had gone up from about 2 to 3 hours to 6 to 8 hours on average per day, which meant women and girls were spending basically a working day collecting firewood because they had to travel further and further and bring it back. And it was more and more tedious and expensive and arduous to do this. So you would say, oh my God, that's sad, but it's inevitable. That's a cost you have to pay for afforestation. And it's too bad that they have to walk longer, but it's a conflict between green and women's work or something. That's what you would say if you just heard this. No, you don't have to do it that way. Why was it done that way? Because, as I said, the men were in those committees and the men don't do this, so they didn't factor this in as an issue. In Bengal, there was an experiment to have women-only forest management committees in several districts, in Jalpaiguri and so on, several districts, Siliguri in the northern part of Bengal, and Dinajpur and so on. And these women-only forest management committees, so it was said, yes, it's one from every household, but it has to be a woman. Okay, these women-only forest management committees worked out a system whereby they would actually enter forests and have for certain hours a day, have specifically marked areas and ensure that it would be done in a way that regenerated that forest, that you didn't take away so much that you would actually destroy the forest. So they were marked off, but women were allowed into those areas for limited hours and with clear guidelines about how to extract the fuel wood. And it worked. They were just as successful in regenerating. They didn't get an increase in the hours walked to collect the fuel wood. And why did that happen? Because the women who were in the committees, they're the ones who are going to be walking. So they wanted to do it in a way that would actually make sure that they didn't increase their own labor time. Whereas the men in the household weren't bothered. It wasn't a big concern for them. They didn't even think of it. It wasn't factored in as one constraint. So when you bring the women in who are doing all that unpaid work, they will factor that in. They will work out a solution. And it turns out that they did work out this solution. It is possible. So there was no inherent conflict between afforestation and unpaid labor time. The conflict occurred because that particular strategy was one that was designed and implemented by men who didn't have to do that unpaid labor. I could give you many, many more examples of how one does, the attitude to unpaid labor and basic amenities, which in India it's completely destroyed our policy making because it's basically made by men or by women bureaucrats who have begun to think like men because there aren't enough of them in those top level positions. Final point maybe I could mention is about safety and work hours and conditions at work. Again, many examples of safety and conditions at work and flexi time. COVID now has indicated how flexi time can happen because it's forced on us in conditions of pandemic and so on. But so many women who are minorities in offices have faced very long hours of commuting, very rigid work hours, which it turns out are not so necessary because of the way the workday is structured. And it's done because all of these decisions and management kinds of things, strategies, are imposed largely by men or by the few women who make it to the top, who then have to behave like men. Okay, they cannot sort of assert that no, it's important to allow this flexibility for childcare. It's important to enable some people to come in at 12 if they want and leave at 4 if they want, and do the rest of the work in a remote fashion in different ways at home. They wouldn't dare say so because that would suggest that they are less, workaholic than men. And you know how top management also always has to pretend that they're workaholic, pretend or actually be workaholic just to prove their commitment to that company or that organization or that workspace, whatever. So it is only when you have enough women, and that brings me back to the point I made earlier. It's only when you have enough women out there to change the culture of a workplace, of an organization, of a bureaucracy, of a government. It's only then that you actually get sufficient change. Otherwise, when there are very few women or only women right at the top, it's not good enough. They have to end up behaving like men. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that the gender construction of society is such that, it's really that men are inevitably doing certain jobs and women are inevitably doing a lot of the other kinds of jobs, including unpaid labor at home. Even when women are able to outsource that work to domestic workers, it's the women who are responsible for organizing it. It's the women who are seen as responsible if something is happening, the child is sick, the elderly relative needs more help, the disabled person needs more assistance. It's the women who are in charge of either the direct care or indirectly enabling that care. And all of that colors how they approach the workspace as well. Now, until you have enough women in that workspace who will recognize these constraints and enable that workspace also to be more flexible, you will not get either the recognition of how that workspace can be efficiently organized or the need to actually change those divisions of labor back in the household and the community and so on. So you need enough women. That's why, in fact, I'm a big advocate of quotas for women. And not because I'm a woman and so I think it'll be good for my sisters and my daughters and so on. No, not for that. Because ultimately, it's not just more inclusive, but that inclusivity is more efficient. It generates better practices of management and of how you actually operationalize both policies and work. And it gives you better and more stable and more dynamic outcomes over time. We have seen this with Panchayati Raj. That's the only place where we have women's quotas, right? At the Panchayat level. And we've seen that over time, it gives you a different dynamic at the Panchayat level. In the beginning, yes, there's a lot of the surrogate thing happening, that somebody puts up their wife or their daughter and they run the thing directly or indirectly. And this is very true in a lot of North India as well. But over time, that dynamic changes. And in fact, I have met in Karnataka and Rajasthan and men who are really disgruntled because they say, we put my wife up, but by her second term, she wants to do her own thing. She's not listening to me anymore. Or my daughter was put up there and I thought I could direct it. And now she says she's more educated and she knows better and she's doing it. She's not listening to me. There are, in fact, processes that generate. A similar thing has been found in in European Union, where they have a 10% quota on management boards. It's a very small quota, 10%. It's been expanded now to 20%. And it's found that when you have more warm bodies, actually, when you have a greater mass of women, it changes the culture in a way that having one or two women cannot. So I would say the significance of women leadership is not just having that one leader, just that one breaking through the glass ceiling and making it and being an icon for the others and so on. No, it's having enough women out there to change the culture of a government, of a company, of any organization at any level. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sure there will be much more interesting questions. So I'm not going to keep boring you on with just my views. Let's have a discussion now.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was a great talk. The first question that we have is from Isha. So, as you had mentioned that you've retired and you will be moving to the US. So, the question is, could you please tell us more about your journey? When and how did you decide to go for a PhD and then join academia? And can you tell us some of the major challenges that you faced and how did you overcome them?
That is a very interesting question. And let me be honest, I've had a very easy life. Most of my life has been, really not one that has faced many constraints. When I see some of my young women students and the constraints that they have had to face and overcome and the courage that they've had to display, I'm in awe because I've had a very, very easy life, relatively speaking. Uh, so I came from a family of in fact, bureaucrat economists. My father was an economist by training who was in the government. So it was not unusual for me to go on to higher education. And I was lucky enough, I would say, very fortunate to be able to do an MA in JNU. I think it was an extraordinarily liberating experience for me because JNU, even then, was marked by diversity. I think one of the great things about JNU is that it had a very strong quota system and also a lot of affirmative action in addition. It gives extra marks for people who come from backward areas and so on. And so we had, even when I was a student, we had a very diverse class. That made a very big difference. I grew up in an elite upper middle class household, so you don't really meet people from very, very different classes, castes, regions, backgrounds. I had classmates who were, either the son of a policeman in a village in Uttar Pradesh or the daughter of somebody who was oppressed by policemen in Uttar Pradesh, both in the same class. It makes a huge, that kind of variety of experience does so much to open you up to different kinds of experiences which are not your own. And I think that's essential. For a real education, you need that. You won't get it just from your teachers or from other classmates who are exactly like you. You really need to be exposed to difference. I think that was a great strength of JNU. I really hope that that continues. Yes, then I went to England, and that, again, very privileged sort of experience, right? I was at the University of Cambridge, a very elite university. The diversity there is the regional diversity, it's international. We had a very, out of the group of the cohort of PhD students, let's say, the 5 years, because it takes about 5 years. So people who joined to the people who went. I think maybe out of 100, there were 2 English people. Everybody else was from some other country, Latin America, Europe, America, Africa, So it was very diverse. That diversity also is nice. It gives you different kinds of contexts and so on. I have to say that, being a woman was never a big constraint for me all through that period. And it hasn't really been a constraint in that sense. However, economics is a very chauvinistic discipline. There's no doubt about it. And I realized that only when I finished my, my PhD and I was looking for jobs and I had jobs. And then I realized how that it's actually a very sexist profession. I was a consultant in the ILO, and I realized that there are very few women in the professional category. Most of the women were secretaries. The atmosphere in the ILO at the time in the mid 1980s was extremely patriarchal and sexist. So most of the men, many who came from developing countries, had real difficulty dealing with a woman as an equal, professional equal. They were used to dealing with women as secretaries. And let's admit it, also as sex objects. There would be all these men standing at the door of the corridor watching the secretaries go up and down in their little mini skirts. It was pretty grim as an overall kind of. Even in India, I mean, in my generation, there were relatively few women economists. And often, you would be in a conference and people would at the end of it say, oh, your sari was so beautiful, rather than what you said was so significant. So, and that persisted for a while. I mean, look, at one level, you're the beneficiary because you fill a quota, right? So they say, oh, we need a woman, so let's get her. Or, oh, we need somebody from a developing country, let's get her. So you kind of tick those boxes, you fill a quota, right? But on the other hand, we were still rarities, oddities, exotic. I think we will need many, many more women in the profession to actually get rid of that thing, to be taken seriously for what we say and for our arguments rather than how we look. I think it's happening, but it still takes, I think the younger women, I'm in awe of the younger women because I see so many different things that they have struggled through. I've had a very easy life in comparison, but I think that it's going to be better now, basically because we have many more feisty young women who have the spunk and the courage to say, well, we don't care about a whole lot of the other barriers. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The next question that we have is from Anjali, and she writes, gender ratio in most educational institutes is skewed. So what steps could be taken to reduce the gender gap in school enrollment? So as you had mentioned, could availability of toilets be one of the issue? Also, what are the other issues and what should be done to overcome them?
Yes. Well, look, I mean, again, the very fact that we don't have equal numbers of girls and boys' toilets is such a glaring, in your face thing that it's unbelievable, right? Uh, People are now doing RCTs, uh, randomized control trials, to check whether having more girls' toilets increases girls' enrollments. I think doing an RCT like that is obscene. You don't need an RCT to tell you that more girls will go if you have girls' toilets. You really don't need an RCT for that. This is obvious. It shouldn't have been a discrepancy in the first place. Basically, it has to be a minimum norm. And in fact, by the way, in the Right to Education Act, there is a full category of infrastructure in which this is made explicit, that you have to have girls' toilets in every school at every level. So if you don't, it's actually against the law. And the idea, you can still have these fancy development economists coming from the US and taking $1 million to tell a state government that we will do an RCT to tell you that it makes a difference to girls' enrollment. To me, that's obscene. It's obvious. Obviously, we need the basic infrastructure, but it's more than that. I mean, the toilets is a given, but it's more than the toilets. It's the distance to the schools. It's the street lighting on the way to and from the schools. It's the degree of safety that the younger women in middle school and up, the secondary and higher secondary schooling, that the girls will be able to go safely on their own if necessary and come back from those schools. All of these are issues that we do not address. So, it's not just the toilet, it's much, much more than the toilet. It's the hours of schooling. I have friends who were in Madhya Pradesh involved in the public education system, and they found that, if you delay the school hours from 7 to 9 o'clock, that gives more of the girls who have to do certain household jobs have to do it, and they're going to do it whether you like it or not. And we can say we don't want them to do it, and we should tell the parents. It's not going to happen. Those girls are going to end up having to do that. When they started school later, they had much more girls enrollment, especially again at the secondary and higher secondary levels. So these are issues that, again, once you are sensitive to these, you don't need fancy experiments. You don't need, I mean, these are obvious things that anybody would be able to tell you if you actually went and asked those, the women and the girls in particular, that what is preventing you. So I think a lot of these are easily available solutions, which really we don't have to tell people about. Why was the bicycle scheme in Bihar so popular? Because it enabled girls to get to school, which they would not have been able to. And we found that wherever you provide the enabling conditions, girls' enrollment rockets up. It's not lack of their own desire to learn. I mean, you really, once you have enabling conditions and once households don't see it as excessively expensive or something that will threaten their security, you have massive increases in girls' enrollment in medium, in secondary and higher secondary.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question that we have is again on education. So the question is, do you see scope for the marriage of vocational and liberal education in a single university, or should there be separate systems for the two?
So this is an interesting point, and it really goes back to one's idea of what is a university. So there are different societies and countries have done different models. There's been, if you like, the British model, which is essentially one which has done a complete diversion, and that can be okay, but sometimes it's a bit problematic because it's another kind of caste system. I went to a university, you went to a technical college, you went to, you were an intern somewhere. That doesn't work. There can be another, which is a German style, where you actually have a combination of everything up to secondary level, and then you have then you get the diversion after the higher secondary, after the schooling. And there's a third strategy, which I believe is actually something quite feasible, which says that a lot of what is called vocational or technical training is actually quite skilled. That is absolutely true in the care industry, which we have denigrated. Therapeutic care is something which is highly skilled, or early childhood learning. It's actually highly skilled. We don't treat it as highly skilled, but it is. And there's no reason for someone who is doing early childhood pedagogy or who is doing elderly care not to be given the advantages of the latest developments in psychology, which come in universities, or not to have access to anthropological studies, which will enable them to deal with people from different ethnic backgrounds. So I think we really need to have a merging of the two. A campus should be a place where, at one level, these kinds of liberal arts training, which are essential for anyone dealing with interpersonal kinds of activities, are available to a whole range of people. And you don't say, oh, well, that's low grade stuff. We don't need the fancy artificial intelligence type of knowledge for that. You do. And so I would say, yes, we have to integrate them. I mean, the universities of the future should give a liberal arts training to everybody, including the physicist, including the care worker, including the engineer, including the carpenter. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question again continues with academia, and the question is that even within academia, for example, in economics, leadership in terms of academic councils or Nobel Prize committees play a role in recognizing important research and narratives within the subject, which further impacts the legitimacy of arguments when policies are being made. What has been the impact of lack of women in these committees on economics and other streams of knowledge?
Well, if you're looking at the economics profession and what is called the Nobel, it's not actually a Nobel Prize. The Nobel Committee does not award the economics prize. It's given by the Swedish Central Bank in memory of Alfred Nobel. Nobel himself, the Nobel Foundation, and the children of Nobel were vehemently opposed to an economics prize because they said economics is not a science. And I think the way the prize has been given has been a confirmation of that. It's been very random. It is certainly very male. I think every single member of that committee is a man. And it's dominantly gone. It's a very restricted prize because it's not just that it's gone to white men dominantly, but that it's also very much a reflection of the North Atlantic. And that it is therefore a reflection of the power imbalances within the economics discipline. And let's face it, economics as a discipline is very hierarchical, it's very contained and limited, and it has gatekeepers big time. So it is non-inclusive, not only in terms of the origin of the people who are rewarded and so on, but also in terms of the kinds of economics that it rewards. So it is very mainstream discipline oriented, and it doesn't reward, recognize anybody who questions that. The heterodox economists, the great economists of the past, Joan Robinson, Nicholas Caldo, were not recognized. The great economists across the developing world are never even thought of because they're based in the developing world. They were not taken seriously. And anybody who has a different heterodox opinion is not taken. The gatekeepers ensure that they don't get published in the top journals. They don't, get the kind of recognition that would give them tenured professorships in major top universities. and therefore they don't get the prizes. So yes, I would say economics is much worse than the sciences in that respect, because there is a real active strategy of keeping out the alternative, even when the alternative has been shown to be more correct, more relevant, more useful for understanding how economies work.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question, if it's all right, because we are already at time. If it's all right, can we have a couple more questions?
Maybe the last couple of questions. Why don't you say both of them, and then we can.
Sure. So the question is, as touched upon towards the end, the need for diversity calls upon steps like reservation for promotion of inclusivity. However, these steps are met with populist opinions of them being detrimental to meritocracy. A similar example has been seen recently with the introduction of female seats in IITs. How do you propose the importance of these steps can be communicated to the proponents of these opinions? And a similar question that we have is on your point on quotas in leadership. Is the one woman director on the board of companies too less, because there is still a disproportionate ratio of men on the board seats?
Yeah, let me take the second question first. Absolutely, one woman is not enough. And that's what they found in Europe. They began with 10%, now they've increased it. I think some countries have made it 25% and 30%. And I think in the Nordic countries, in Scandinavia, it's now half. Because one is simply not enough. I have been in so many international conferences. I've been the sole woman, or I've been in meetings where I'm the sole woman. It's just not good enough, because you do not, either you're hesitant, or if you make your point too much, then you're that's loud, shrewish, aggressive type, and so you don't want to be seen as that, so you tone yourself down. It doesn't work. You really need to have enough women, even to make rather obvious points, like the toilet point, right? It should be an obvious point. I have sat in meetings in government organized agencies in planning where people are rolling their eyes saying, oh God, she's rabbiting on about toilets again. So yes, you definitely have to have more. It's not enough to have one or two. You must have more. Having the one is one of those token measures. And I have been such a recipient of tokenism through decades. I know how ineffective that is. On how do we persuade people about quotas? Because yes, there's a real visceral reaction, right? There's all this talk about merit and meritocracy and how we're undermining merit. And it's really shocking to me that a lot of the reaction to merit is not really about merit. It's about a deep fear of the privileged, that they will lose that privilege. And let's face it, whether it's the upper castes or it's men, nobody likes to give up privilege. It's fun. Yeah, it's better. And there will always be the pushback, and that pushback is usually expressed in terms of merit. I remember when, the National Knowledge Commission, of which I was the sole woman at the time, and the sole lefty, so I kind of ticked both boxes, if you like. There was this whole discussion about quotas, and everybody was against it except me. And it was not women quotas, it was caste quotas. And they were all very, merit. And when there was a vote, and I was the only one who had voted in favor of the OBC quota at the time, I got so much hate mail. And it was extraordinary hate mail, because it was things like, may you get sick and be treated by an OBC doctor, or, I hope you have to only teach OBC students for the rest of your life. And I would like to tell all those people who wrote that kind of thing, that yes, if I'm treated by an OBC doctor, I would love to be treated by Vellore, which has the best doctors in the world. Vellore has 95% quotas, 95%, because they have all different kinds of quotas, Christian, caste, this, that, okay? Vellore doctors are by far the best in the country, the Christian Medical College in Vellore, you probably know it. It's not something, my subsequent colleague in the National Knowledge Commission, he joined after that particular vote. He was the head of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, which is well known to be the top science institution in the country, the top institution in the country. It's always the head of all the rankings, etc. They have massive quotas. Again, they have 75% quota, because they again have different kinds of quotas. He says, by far the students who come in on reservation are the best. Why? Because they're very serious, they're very determined, they're very anxious to do it, and they're so responsible. You tell them to do something, you know they will do it. You know they will work on that until it's done. And of course, intelligence is normally distributed in a society. We know that. We know that it's not that Brahmins are more intelligent or men are more intelligent, right? It's normally distributed. So if you get the normal distribution of intelligence and you get that much more determination to succeed among a certain group because they're historically disadvantaged as a group, you're going to get better results. It follows. So anybody who tells you that it's going to destroy quality or merit and all that, just point them to Vellore CMC, to Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and say, look, these are institutions that have done quotas determinedly for decades. And you tell me that they are worse than an IIT or some institution, some private university that is not doing quotas. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a couple more questions, but I guess in the interest of time, maybe next time. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes. No, it was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'll hand it over to Urmi now. Urmi.
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you for taking out time, and we are genuinely honored by having you here. I am still in awe of all that you said, and I think we'll take some time to process it.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, I would also like to thank, because we live in a capitalist society, Business Standard, who is the print media partner for the summit. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
No, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for all the questions. Yeah. Thanks a lot, everyone.